Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Garmin. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. I know it's quite an obligation to come out in the middle of the evening on a work night, so I hope to not bore you. It is about testing, so if you have no interest in talking about testing, you can leave now and just wait up Austin's for everybody else. I will try not to bore you. So I'm also not very much about making slides. I'd rather just get straight into the code. I will not code in front of you directly, but I can if pressed. A little bit about me. I'm Bryan Kelly. I'm a senior software architect at Cerner. Been at Cerner for about 10 years. Rob Winch was my mentor at Cerner when I started. Learned a lot from him. He's the reason why I got started in Spring. I've been primarily focused on moving Network IP, which is my organization, into using Spring Boot applications. Spring Cloud, Cloud Native, microservices, insert additional fun buzzword here and there. We're currently working on moving and getting a Pivotal Cloud Foundry environment set up for all of Cerner. We've got quite a few different options that are currently in flight right now, but we're currently working on that, so if you have any questions or have any insights to share, we'd definitely love to hear from you, because we've been talking to some people at Garmin because they've been doing and been on that journey, but definitely fun to share those stories if anybody's interested. But I guess the context of this talk is fairly simple. The title of it was Slice, Slice, Baby. So in Spring Boot 1.4, they introduced this capability of doing test slices. So it made it easier to do auto configuration, very finely scoped to different use cases of what you're wanting to test. So for instance, there's the ability to do repository level testing and focus primarily on what the repository is doing, and controller testing, and then also tests on your JSON markup. So tonight's talk is coming in with a little bit of some reference architecture. It won't really be useful to those that aren't doing these things, but you need to be using REST controllers. There's a lot of content that's mostly around those. You would typically want to have like a service layer. This example doesn't necessarily have one, but in real world use cases, you'd kind of have a REST controller, then a service layer, and then below that, your service would be leveraging repositories or JDBC template, but this example uses repositories from Spring Data, and then those would be leveraging a database. So kind of like an N-tier architecture. Most microservices in our realm kind of look like this now, and we're moving a lot of our testing to looking like what I'm going to show tonight. We also have a few guidelines that we follow. We really try to still stick to interface development. So, your repositories have an interface associated to them, and they're extending like CRUD repository. You're cleanly distributing your code across many different packages. Yes, sir, I can try my best. Tell me when? Okay, sorry. It does look really good on my screen. So this is a very simple Spring Data repository. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Spring Data, but my team kind of was hesitant to kind of jump in. We were using Hibernate directly for a really, really long time. We had no issues. We weren't really seeing a lot of value. They made enough feature enhancements to Spring Data to where we're like, okay, this is getting a little out of hand. Then they added support for the JPA specifications, and it was kind of a done deal for us. I've been pressing on one of my colleagues to give a Spring Data talk because I think it'd be very useful for some to hear. So I'll give you his name after this if you want to give him pressure. So because he's done a really, really good job on our team of using Spring Data for a lot of our stuff. So I'm actually going to go to my point of inspiration, which was this blog post that came out in April, well, a little over a year ago now. When Spring Boot 1.4 was released, they put out this blog post, and they said, testing with Spring, and this spoke to me. I was like, this is exactly how we test with Spring today. I'm not doing anything wrong, so I'm good. I'm following the playbook. And they go, okay, you structure of your test, you have a component, You know, you have some methods, you mock the service that you're calling, and then you inject it into your component, and you're like, okay, and then I go into my Spring Boot recap, and I'm like, okay, yes, I'm doing this, and I'm doing context configuration. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. So I'm like, I'm reading this blog post, and I'm like, I'm not learning anything new. What am I doing wrong here? What's the value they're providing to me? And we had recently just done some web integration tests at the behest of Rob Winch, and I was like, okay, yeah, this is great. This is good. And then came the money shot, which was, okay, Spring Boot 1.4 simplifications. So first of all, the first thing that really caught my eye was like, okay, we simplify run with Spring Runner. Okay, that's pretty cool. And then they go, okay, there's Spring Boot test annotation. This is actually really great for just some very general testing. Nothing really crazy going on here, but it does help if you're using Spring Boot and you want to write a unit test that leverages your current application.yamls and all of that stuff and all of your auto-config. This actually helped bootstrap everything and load it all up the way that you would want it to and expect it to, as if it was running for real in production. We're like, okay, that's cool. And then the next thing that was kind of cool was it's like, okay, REST template, fun, random port, okay, yeah, that makes things. And then there's the test REST template. That's not in scope for this talk, but it could almost sit on a talk on its own if you like REST template. Most of us don't, so you'll have to find somebody to have a conversation about that. Maybe you could get Josh Long to talk about it emphatically because he just loves everything. I don't know, but not me. So we were doing this as well. We were mocking and spying on things and what the real system was doing. It was good, it's okay, but it's complicated. When you spy on things, it gets kind of out of control. And the code becomes, like, this looks okay here, but then when you blow it out to scale, you're like, okay, I'm spying on a vehicle service that's going to get vehicle details, and then it will return a new vehicle. Okay, well, all right, that's fun, whatever. Well, then this is where I still was not very happy with this blog post. I don't know why I even show it, but it's fine. It was at the end that I was happy about. I'm not happy with this section, so we'll just skip it. So then they got to testing application slices. This is where they really started talking about, okay, we've added some things. We added entity scan. I don't know if anybody uses JPA, but configuring what entities you want to have looked up and loaded into your JPA repository, we had written this exact annotation like 4 times. Just to register all of our entities. This was nice because it basically said everything under this class, the class that I'm annotating, every package underneath it will be scanned by default, and then I can pass into this annotation, what packages it wants or should be scanned to bring the entities in that will be used by Spring Data. If you don't do that, JPA just blows up, throws exceptions all over the place saying the entity's not registered. The next annotation that they added was DataJpa test. DataJpa test was so useful because what it does is it brings in just the auto configuration classes that you need to test with a Spring Data repository, or you could use the JDBC template. And it also brings with you an entity manager. It's called a test entity manager that's already set up to go with an in-memory database. So now you've kind of checked a bunch of stuff off that you would normally have written like test configuration for, which was what we were doing, and replace all of it with these 2 annotations, DataJpa test and entity scan. So in my coding example, what I've done is I've got my entity configuration, which literally is entity scan, and then all of my entities and controllers and everything are kind of off of this base package. You could definitely organize this differently and be more restrictive about it, but I've kept it fairly simple. And so the entity that's really in question is this album entity. Again, very mundane entity. Annotate with add entity. It has an ID on it. The rest of it's very Pojo-like. I could have used Lombok and I would have just had this top part. Very simple. Okay, I got my entity wired up, and then I created a repository, which was really simple. It was just a CRUD repository from Spring Data. If I look at the package structure up here, it's super simplistic. It's literally just CRUD repo from Spring Framework Data Repository. I added a method to it. I'm giving this overview because I want to show you guys kind of like, okay, how does this apply to my tests? But I've written very little code, but I've actually got a lot of value here. I've got a repository that can do, if we look at this interface, It now can do saving, it can save a bunch of entities, it can find one, exist, find all. This is all the capabilities that this repository now has. I've gotten those for free from Spring Data. So let's jump into our repository test. Again, this is very simple. I coded this one just to basically keep it simple and to make it easy for us to see, like, if I run the test, it's going to give me a green bar. That's really the only reason why I wrote the test. But what we're doing here is very specific to the example, but it's what my team moved to doing. And we actually did two approaches to this. The other one is a little too long-winded to show, but you have an entity manager and you can persist an entity. And so that is automatically kind of committed to an in-memory database. The test entity manager does some magic behind the scenes to just make sure that the entity is there and queryable. Then I use just the repository to find the title and all that. And then if we look at the console down below, we'll see that it's actually logging out the insert statement and the select statement that was performed by Hibernate. So I can go in there and take a look at those, make sure everything's kind of what I'm expecting. If I had a repository method that was a little bit more gnarly or was using specifications or was an ACK query, you could see it here still, which is nice to see. And then when it was asserted, we were using Java AssertJ assertion. So you're asserting that the album's returned from the repository is not empty, and then you extract out of it the title, and in this case I did the release timestamp. And so I could probably give a whole talk on AssertJ. It's one of my favorite libraries in the world. But in this case, it's very, very prescriptive. It's very simple. It uses Fluent APIs that can chain together. In this case, it's extracting out every album entity with the title field and with the release timestamp field and asserting that it contains only the title to the extreme and the timestamp of when it was released. So in this case, this is kind of like summing up the first tier of the architecture, which is repository testing. Questions? I believe the test entity manager is a part of boot. Yeah. It's using some boot features to kind of do the auto configuration and things like that to kind of make it happy. So, but it's very powerful and it works really, really well. Question?
Before this wonderful presentation, I was taking my data and bringing it into a test resource or some way to integrate it.
Yes.
What's the difference? Why would I like this approach better than, hey, here's my data that I'm going to persist in memory database? Why would I need this over?
That's the more extreme example that my team does. So we actually use, and I just didn't know if anybody would care, there's an @SQL annotation now. I think it's @SQL. That basically you provide the scripts that you want it to run, and it actually would do all of the inserts, table creation, inserts into multiple tables for a given use case. And so then, I don't know how you were porting your data in between your in-memory databases. I don't know if it was just an SQL script or what. Yeah. That's what we do for more extreme use cases. So I don't know if Rob knows if there's any more or less better approaches to using the test entity manager. We don't actually use it extremely all the time, but I think there's a few more features.
So part of the reason why you have the test entity manager versus just using an entity manager itself is because it has some extra bells and whistles wired into it.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure that Spring auto-wires the test entity manager only into your tests and the real entity manager only into your actual classes. So that's why there's a difference versus just using an entity manager. And then why would you use the test entity manager versus using scripts? That is basically because it's kind of a pick your poison sort of thing. Because if you've done the SQL and you say, okay, I'm going to initialize my database like this, and you set up all your tests, and then you do some refactoring, and you pull out all your hair, cry a little.
Yep.
The refactoring isn't nearly as pleasant as if you're doing
Yeah.
that. So, but you're going to get much more. At that point, you're relying on the fact that JPA is setting things up correctly.
Right.
So there's a little trade-off there. Like, can I trust JPA? If you feel like you can trust it, then you can use that. Or if you don't trust it, you can use SQL, but then you have a hard time doing refactoring.
Yeah, so what, for simple cases, we do it this way. We have this one complex service use case where the service is very dependent upon lots of rows existing in the database in a very specific set that's not, if it changed, like we're making non-passive changes and we're kind of expecting it to be in this like scenario case. In that case, we just load it up and then we run the service test against it. So I think there's kind of also depending on the point of view that you're testing. So like if you're testing from okay, my service is too complex to mock the repository's answers, but I want to still use an in-memory database. Maybe SQL files maybe work for you because maybe you could take a snapshot of building that data out in a real system or with a DBA. But then the corollary to that is all I'm doing is doing CRUD tests with my repository as a sanity check, or I want to do a sanity check on finding by a bunch of different criteria or against a specification and doing lots of different boundary checks. Then this probably works better for you because you're probably only doing that on 1 or 2 rows. Okay, your use case. Yeah.
Big data set. Hey, here's all my data. It's like I said, I
Yeah.
have this data covering all these different cases. So then my tests go in and check, does this case work? Does this case work?
Right.
But I would much prefer
Yeah.
something like this. I want to get rid of that.
Yeah.
I want to get rid of that so I can come down and say,
Yeah.
hey, yes, this case works.
Yes.
You can isolate your SQL loading too if you needed to use SQL by putting it on a method. So it's
Oh, yep.
a method, and it's done basically in a transaction, so it'll roll back. And so if you want to do it more isolated, you can do that. So that can help. But the SQL I've also seen very beneficial if you're testing scenarios where you've done migration and you want to make sure that the way that the data was loaded into the database in version 1.0 still works in your 2.0 scenarios.
Yep. Again, more when you have a snapshot in time that you're really wanting to write a bunch of tests to. So I think that's great. It sounds like you're moving towards slicing, which makes my presentation look very valuable. So I love that. Thank you. So that's the first slice that we started with. We just kind of took our repositories. We said, okay, we're going to assert these. We're going to test these. This one's kind of dummy, but we've all done this before, so I didn't want to get too extreme with it. But that's it in a nutshell. Any other questions about repositories? No? Okay, cool. So moving on, now we've asserted that our repository is completely sane. I almost consider it now a don't care from this point forward. Yeah.
I was going to add one thing.
Sure.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but the other thing that's cool about the DataTestJpa test, I might be mixing up the order of this, but the other thing that's cool about it is it's only loading the means relevant to DataTestJpa. So if you have like controllers and stuff like that, it ignores those and it'll speed up the testing.
Yeah. And it helps for doing things in parallel too, which we haven't experimented with, right? Yeah.
I didn't know that helped with that, honestly.
Yeah. I could almost do a whole... And we did a lot of work to try to reduce the runtime, so not just breaking the tests down into smaller application contexts were nice, and then being able to run multiple methods in parallel were also nice because the tests were very self-contained. So like with the add SQL and the methods, made sure that they were kind of, not locked into one another, and then being able to have the...
Do you have control of that? I mean,
Sure.
tests, okay, because I mean, tests should be completely self-contained.
Yes. Well, and that was a huge problem on a lot of our code bases for a long time, which was, okay, the database was like, okay, well, we got to go insert that row first, do this, and we do it in a real database, and we do it end to end. Okay, a lot of our code was written that way, so we were fraught with environmental issues, connectivity issues. If the database was down, developers would say, well, I can't get my work done because my database is down. It's like, okay, this is getting a little bit beyond the pale. So it was like, let's get to testing more in isolation, reproducible units of work. You are leaning, one of the cons that some have expressed to me is that you are leaning on the contracts of things below you. So like in the case of repositories, you're leaning on that CRUD repository contract at the Spring Data level to kind of do what its job is. You may not find a bug in that until you run it against the actual database. And so when you start to talk about testing, you still need to have end-to-end smoke tests, but the hope is that you're testing more of the happy path and you can kind of get on with it instead of, what we were doing every permutation under the sun, and we were having our test take upwards of an hour or an hour and a half to run, and that's not good. That was a lot of work.
Elaborate on how it's helping with the DataJpa helps with parallel, because I didn't know about that. Is it just because, is it really the transaction management that's
The transaction management, and then I would say it's more of the discipline that it forces you to have in writing your test. So one of the things that our developers were doing was we were worried about cleaning data up. So we would hold on to references at, say, the class level of, okay, these are all the rows that I inserted, and then we'd have in our shutdown or our cleanup phase of our test, go and delete all of these rows, right? So then the problem is then if you're taking two tests and running them in parallel, or if you're taking two methods and running them in parallel, you have problems with classes, and you have to write, to get them in parallel, then you have to write rules.
So it's really the transaction management aspect. Okay.
That, and again, the discipline. I think it really keeps you kind of in these guardrails of like, okay, I'm going to put this and persist this within this transaction, which most of this entire test would be considered a part of a transaction. Yeah. Very good. So moving on to the next slice of the test, I've skipped over it, but you would normally have a service that maybe consumes multiple repositories. This example is a little too simplified, but in that case, the data tests, the DataJpa tests definitely help, but because you could set up the test however you would want to, or you can mock the repository and then mock some other dependencies that your service may have, but I think that's very up to you what you end up doing. What I wrote was just a very simple controller. It's nothing too extravagant. It has security on it, and I'm going to talk about testing security calls here in a minute. So don't get too concerned about the pre-authorized annotation. If you haven't seen it before, I'll explain it. This controller is just using, one of the things that they also introduced in recent versions of Spring is not having to annotate every dependency in your controller as auto-wired, and having to have auto-wire on your controller's constructor. So you can kind of clean all of that out, and you can have a very simple POJO-like constructor with your repositories being injected in, which actually helps with the next slice of the testing, which is the WebMvcTest. Then you can also have, the other thing that I'd like to point out is just the Git mapping. Also came out in 1.4 and was enhanced in 1.5. I think something was enhanced. I'm not completely sure. 1.3, yeah. So these are also nice because they help clean up the mapping. So if you haven't seen those before, they are out there. If you've taken recent Spring Boot upgrades, that's something that was in one of the change release notes, and it kind of went and nobody talked about it anymore, but it helped clean up the mappings a little bit. I know my team was pretty excited about that. And then finally, the repository in this case is just very, very simple. It's not doing anything extravagant. That's really not the point. So any questions on this controller and kind of its makeup? No? Okay. So the testing for this is pretty simple. I've kept it simple for a reason. So again, it starts with @run_with Spring Runner. I love that new feature. And then add WebMvcTest, and you basically say what controller or controllers you're wanting this test to be in scope of. And what Spring will then do is it will build a context specific around that controller and its dependencies, or if you say that you will have to provide its dependencies, so either you need to import in configuration that it would necessarily need to run successfully, or you would need to mock any dependencies that it has. In this case, I jumped ahead, wrong version. So in this case, I've turned security off for this set of tests because what I'm really worried about is not if my security is working correctly, and again, this goes back to the slice concept. I'm only focused on my controller and its status responses in terms of response status code, response body, and what it does when given certain sets of input. So for instance, in this case, it's just calling the Git call, the Git mapping call, which was in the controller here that just returns a list of albums. It's going to call that, and it's going to return this result of just album entities that I created. I'm just mocking a response from the album repository. And then that's being injected into the controller because of this mock bean. So every dependency that I want to have injected into the controller that I would prefer to mock its answers or its behavior, I can use this mock bean to kind of control its behavior. I could have also imported the configuration of that repository and got a real version of it, but that's defeating the purpose of the slices. I'm really wanting to just test that controller layer. In this case, it probably wouldn't be, like in real worlds, like in our solutions, we don't actually inject in the repositories into the controller test. We just inject in the service that has a contract with that controller or with that message listener or some kind of stream processor that's like, okay, I'm going to do work, and in this case, it would be in a controller.
Is that mock bean backed by just Mockito?
It is a Mockito mock bean. In fact, it's in the package. Yeah. So the cool thing about that is it's wiring up Mockito, it's dealing with the Mockito init and context, and it's also providing you an auto wiring in the MockMVC. If you haven't looked at MockMVC before, MockMVC is extremely powerful. It has helped simplify our request response processing quite a bit in our systems. We also during this project fell in love with behavioral driven development Mockito, so BDD Mockito, instead of just plain old Mockito. So what you'll see is down here when I do an assertion, or even when I'm saying a mock, given this album repository mock bean, find all will return this result set.
So the mock NBC up there.
Yeah.
So like how? Because usually when I set it up, like you say like set up like standalone mock NBC. So how is it knowing what to configure it as?
Part of that is the magic of the WebMvcTest. Is it's bringing in the WebMvcTest context bootstrapper. It's looking at the controller that you're wanting to test or sets of controllers. And then that wires up the paths. So let's just run this test here, and you can kind of see in the logs. So you'll see that the only things that were wired up was the air path and the V1 albums paths. Not all, if I would have had multiple controllers in here, not all of those would have been booted up and wired into the context. So again, it cuts down on the startup time. It cuts down on the amount of. It also has helped our developers be able to develop in parallel, because the hope is you also have a contained slice of the application that you're able to work in parallel, writing your test, working on your controller. And when you check that in, the hope is, and we've seen this be pretty true, when you check your stuff in, it's not getting broken by somebody else. So again, that slicing mentality, you're also slicing up work, and you're working on these controllers in isolation, which has been very beneficial. So again, this will kind of dive into, okay, so I haven't set anything up with this MVC, the mock MVC. I can just go and say perform get on that call, on that path. I can say I'm accepting JSON. This is very powerful. You could say if your controller does some sort of content negotiation, you could say application XML. You could have said a PDF. You could have said text. And then if your controller was negotiating with that, I know we've done that in many cases for like file downloads, you can now test them here. You could basically say, hey, give me I can't remember what the content disposition headers all have to look like, but you could set all those up, and then when it calls your controller's going to go, okay, I'll go grab that binary data and I'll stream it out to you. You can perform that test here now instead of having it be, an end-to-end test with a REST template or some other library on the other end and ensuring that blob is persisted. You don't have to do that anymore. You can kind of test that and assert that it all works as expected here. And then you have the and specs, which is basically just saying, okay, what status was returned, what content type was returned, and then what content was returned, in this case JSON, and this wires up all the JSON assertions around the JSON payload that you ingested in. In this case, what I did is I kind of, we have two camps on my team. We have the camp that would just prefer to auto-wire in an object mapper and then just generate the JSON based upon the entity or the object that you're wanting to return. And then it falls into refactoring land very, very nicely. I add a new field. This test doesn't necessarily have to be touched. I just maybe have to update one place and everything's copacetic. I'm not in that camp, so I'll talk about what I prefer, and some people want to kill me, but that's okay. I don't really like it generating that, because if I do make a change to a field that's non-passive, my test won't catch it. So that's kind of scary to me, especially with payloads, because we provide them as a contract to other teams. And to UIs, and I don't want a bug in the UI being blamed on my service team because we'd rather blame it on the UI. They make more mistakes than the service team. Only one of them's here tonight, so I can make fun of them. So we prefer to go, okay, this is our JSON response that we're expecting, and this can be kind of a sticking point for some, but kind of once you wrap your head around it, and I prefer this approach. Some may not, but I don't know if there's a group at Pivotal that has a preferred approach or over another.
I think it's, everything in life has its trade-offs. You just got to weigh them through a particular scenario and put your own personality into it and
Yeah.
make a choice. I don't think it's
Because the other option is you could get the JSON back and you could ingest it into an object, and then you could assert at every level like we did with AssertJ before too. And we've done that in some cases where the objects are a little bit more complex. My third use case is pretty simple. All I'm doing here is just calling albums with a param. So I'm passing in a param into my controller, and then that controller is basically saying, okay, when I see title with a value equal to hot space, then it will return an album entity that basically looks like this, and I'm asserting the JSON. So the cool thing is when this test runs, again, I don't care about the repository underneath. I'm able to easily mock it. I can say, given that repository, return this list of results, and then I can assert that, my expectations on my response are what I expect. And I don't know about some of you, but in our testing, this has helped clean up what the tests look like and be able to maintain them. Again, it's very prescriptive, but it's also provides more discipline to developers to where you get the kind of similar outputs. These are also very, very extendable. So before we go into how you could extend them to do something more complicated, is there any questions about controllers? No? All right, cool. So I wrote I don't know how many people are familiar with Spring Security. I'm a pretty big fan of it. We use it in almost all of our projects. I'm not trying to suck up to Rob. He gets my bugs all the time. I always try to find something that he broke because it's a lot more fun, because he'll give me answers very, very quickly. And that doesn't happen very often, but sometimes it's fun. But in this case, we turned security on. We basically said, yeah, we want this controller to be secure true. And then in my case, I imported security config, and there may be a better way to do that. This is an example, so I was trying to keep it as simple as possible. So the security config class basically says enable global method security. I wanted that on, because on my controller, I wanted to, by the way, you should do more in your security than what I've done. Basic auth is turned on. You should probably pick a protocol that's a little bit more secure, not the subject of this talk. Rob Wunsch owes us a great talk on different ways of securing your applications. I think we all need a nice refresher to put him on the spot. He's staring at me. Yeah, I know. But in this case, you probably should also have said, hey, I want everything, secured with, a given just a base role or something like that. In my case, I even went one step further that probably made it even less secure, and I just said authorized mode on my basic auth was authenticated. I didn't necessarily want it to ensure that they always had a role. This is completely for presentation purposes only. We don't even use basic auth. I had to go read the docs on how to even use it. I didn't even know this flag was here, so I thought it was fun, a little, nugget of knowledge. So if we go back into the authorization albums controller, in this test case, what we're really focused on is oh, I completely missed the part of why I opened that other controller. I'm so sorry. Was to ensure that on a given method in the controller that the pre-authorized annotation is being evaluated. And that if the user has that appropriate role or authority, that it's evaluated properly, and then that the status code that's returned from my service is what I expect. Now note, in the previous test, we turned security off. Everything was 200s, and everybody was happy. Well, that's not the case once you turn security on. If you've done a good job of your security, things get a little bit more unwieldy. In this case, when we call now v1 albums, just like we did before, we don't get back a result. We can't even if we mocked a result, we'd have 0 interactions with the repository because we got back an unauthorized status on the result. So if we look at this test a little bit further, we'll go, okay, well, why? Well, the user, there's no user passed, and there's no authority set. So there was 2 issues. You were unauthenticated, you were not fully authenticated, and your user was not having any roles. So in this case, we would have failed both checks, but we failed the first one because we didn't have a user in context. If I change this to is okay, I'd like to show something that I think makes this very, very powerful. So I expect an okay, but I'm not going to get back an okay. I'm going to get back a 401. Well, when this test failed, Spring Boot Test is smart enough now to return what my mock servlet request was and what my response was. So now I can go in, and it only does this, it used to do this on all requests, and it was very noisy and very hard to kind of get value out of. Now it's gotten more intelligent with later releases. I don't know when they necessarily change this, that when a test now fails, it logs this information out, which it tells you exactly what happened in this case. There's full authentication is required to access this resource. Okay, well, I don't know what that means, but all right, that's cool. 401. Well, if I was the one writing the authentication provider, I'd probably know why that was the case. I didn't write the basic auth one, so my guess is they expected the person that called the system to be fully authenticated, which means that they had logged in with a username and a password in this case, and that passed the user detail service and all that fun stuff, and they were given a security context. In this case, there is no security context, so they're not fully authenticated. So, okay, we'll make it easier. I'll say with user. So user is actually a really cool thing, and I wish I would have downloaded those sources earlier, but I actually downloaded, which is cool. User request post-processor. This is kind of where you're able to now extend the capabilities of the MockMVC request post-processors, which is very, very powerful when you're talking about slicing up your application. I'm now at like a security slice. I'm wanting to say, hey, this user is authenticated. Okay, cool. So they're authenticated. So now I'm going to make the call and in this authorization test slice, and what's going to happen is they're going to say that I am forbidden. So if I change this again to is okay, I think that might be useful. You can basically see that the response that comes back now was forbidden. So the authentication layer said, okay, sure, you're authenticated, user, with user, good to go. But my pre-authorized annotation now in my albums controller basically said, nope, not good enough. You don't have this authority. So that's now being evaluated. Okay, all right. Well, now I feel better about my security. I don't even care how I authenticated. We're not talking about user authentication, user password. Could have been LDAP. Could have been, doesn't matter. No, this test slice, all I care about is authorization. Okay, cool. All right, fine. So then we'll move on. Okay, so let's find that other test. So the last test was, okay, let's call with user admin, with authorities, simple granted authority of albums admin. Just because I'm pedantic, I'll change this to forbidden, because I'm like, shouldn't I be forbidden? That can't be right. And then if I run the test, it'll basically say, well, it fails. We know it's going to fail. And then we can look at the response. It says, okay, 200. You're good. You're authenticated. You're authorized. Yay! Very good. Notice it didn't come back with a body. Any reason why anybody thinks that it didn't come back with a body? I forgot to mock it. But the mocks are smart enough to just kind of be like, cool, move on, I don't care, Because this test slice, I don't even care about the body. I'm not flexing the body based upon the role that they have. I'm not flexing the body based upon who the user is. All I'm testing is that they were authorized. That's all I care about. Because, who tests security? Why would we do that? I mean, come on. I'm using basic auth, so I'm not really testing something that's all that tolerant to being hacked, but that's just another test in another layer of my application. I could plug in something more, performant for security. So this last test is interesting because I was just being really, really, really annoying to myself. And basically, I changed the authority to albums user. Well, that's not the authority that it was expecting, but I wanted to do that test just to make sure that what's ever doing the adjudication, or that Spring Security never has a bug, or the user detail service that I'm using, which we could have a whole talk on just that topic, wired in the authorities properly for the use case that I was wanting to test, and that they were adjudicated properly. So, the cool thing is if I change this to is okay, and I'm like, oh, it's okay. I think in my controller, pre-authorize, I think maybe for finding an album by title, album's user role or authority would be okay. Get out of here, I don't want you. So if we run that test now, I should, oh, I failed. Yay! Access denied, probably because it's on the class. Did I test the wrong one? Okay. That's too bad. Let's see if that's true. Don't have title in the params. Ah! Come on, Rob. Come on, Bryan. Well, I don't want to do that whole thing, so we'll just do it this way. Right. Good, Rob. Rob writes test code. Right, it should be 1 because it was called. What's the question? Yeah. That's cool. Very cool, especially for these tests, because you really want to ensure that the thing, so in this case, in our code, it would have been the service, wouldn't have been the repository. I like making that clarification. We don't code right against the repositories. I mean, unless it's something really, 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 really vanilla. So, any other questions?
Maybe, I'm just curious what other people think. Like these kind of tests, they're not really unit tests because you're getting like testing library code.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know, would people consider like, I think that like an integration test or is it?
I use the same terminology with data as an end-to-end test.
Okay.
And the way that I see testing is you kind of have a pyramid.
Yeah.
And the pyramid is basically all the really nitty-gritty stuff is unit tests.
Yeah.
And then as you add more layers of your application, you start having less and less permutation points. And that's kind of what BK was saying about earlier. They used to do integration tests for
Everything.
all the databases, both the in-memory and the actual database.
Yep.
And then they moved to like a smoke test.
Yep.
And you want to have end-to-end tests and integration tests as well.
Yeah, I'm not arguing against that. I'm kind of wondering where people kind of think like these tests kind of fall like what would you kind of consider them to be, since they're not true, because you're kind of really going, as far as like an integration test doesn't mean going beyond integration tests, since you're really testing.
How about this? If you could have treated the HTTP servlet request as a POJO, which we can't. It's hard to, right? This is our only way into getting into that request and that response, and treat them like POJOs, but they're not POJOs. No. You're wanting to get you want to label it. Yeah.
Where you're testing it. It's like, if you look at the full request, that's the complete story, that's an integration test, but then if you choose 2 endpoints anywhere within that stack, how did you make it? It's an end-to-end test.
Yeah.
I've heard that terminology used, I've heard other terminology used, but it's the one.
Yeah, I like that term because in the world of where we're going to, I could give this exact same talk but invert it to the UI. So then I got the UI making calls to my service. We've been playing with like React and things, and Steven, libraries, go. Jest and Enzyme, right? So we've been using Jest that does a similar thing. It takes a snapshot of what your markup's going to look like when it comes out of the React component, and then it asserts against that. So if you change something about your React component, it breaks the test. In this case, if I were to change something about the interactions in that controller with the service, it's either going to break the response or it's going to break the mock, right? We try to make it to where the mocks are fairly tolerant so they kind of stay out of the way, because what we really care about in this case is the payload. I really like asserting the payload is at least what I expect, and what I consider parts of the payload is response headers, response status, and response body. If you want to put anything else on top of that, go for it by all means. There is no TCP packet sniffing, though, not allowed. But everything else you could do. So we were not doing a very good job of that. And the other cases were like, okay, the service blows up and we get a 500. Well, we were just using the white label air page from Spring Boot for a really long time for 500, and that was okay, but there was like, maybe there's more information in there that we could get our hands on. If we knew the user was authenticated, giving them just kind of a stack trace, which isn't what it was doing, but the message may not have been all that great, we could kind of catch that specific exception, and you could, I don't know if anybody's done it, but you could have exception controllers. And those exception controllers, you could have a whole test suite for just how you handle exceptions. And so, again, you could say perform a request against a test controller. It doesn't really matter then what that controller is, and import in your air controller advice that handles exceptions, and you can marshal those out in a JSON response of what's to the liking of the users or the services that you use. And we've done that for like validation errors and giving back something that's more useful to the UI than what kind of comes out of the box. Because it's just a string, it's just a message. So then there's a lot of places you can go with this. And the other one that's kind of interesting is like, okay, my users experience a timeout. How does my controller, let's say the database times out, okay, I get a connection failure or something like that. How does my controller react to that exception? You could code that use case, and you don't have to be in the real environment because you kind of know, okay, that's going to be one of these, if it's Oracle Aura exceptions, which you probably wouldn't code against those, but it's going to be some Hibernate access exception. You could mock that being thrown by the service or by the repository and then handle it gracefully. That's the direction we went with it because it provided more of those capabilities. Yeah. Good question, though. Any other questions? No? Cool. That's all I have. So, yeah. Yeah, thanks.